Did you hear what they're accusing Mark Carney of? Seriously, did you hear? Because I honestly don't remember. There have been so many accusations, and none of them have stuck because they're either really, really complicated, and you're like, I don't even know what you're saying by the time they're done, or they're really, really bad, but they don't have anything more than an AI generated picture to make you think that maybe the bad thing happened. And what people don't realize is that if news companies actually had a story that they could run that would get them millions of clicks, they would do it. They don't care if they help a bad politician get elected. They're in it for immediate gratification and immediate numbers. Most of Canada's news companies are owned by telecom companies who would love to get someone who would be soft on big companies and who would remove the CRTC's dentures and lock them away. I don't normally do trigger warnings, and I plan on discussing this topic tastefully and in a manner that most people should be okay with. But if you are not someone who can handle that, it is time to scroll away. The interesting thing for me, as a content creator who has a big enough following that I do get bots and wingnut in my comments, but not so many that I can't read every comment that I get, I see certain names and profile pictures over and over again. I've got a few commenters who say largely the same thing on most of my videos, and I assume some of these are bots, but there have been a few who I thought were bots, and then I make a video and it hits them emotionally, and then they say something that a bot would definitely not say. So I'm glad that I didn't, block them. And really, so long as they're not saying something like extremely vulgar or just like I don't even block people for saying lies, but there's certain things that people can say that I'm just like, no, that's you're gone. Like there has to be I'm not even looking for good, like my standards are very low. So if your comment got deleted, there's a good chance that it was actually TikTok that deleted it, not me. But like I even leave ones where people all they do is post lots of blue hearts. Like I don't care. You can say your piece. I'm not super interested in censoring someone unless you're like saying like really cruel things to an individual person. And I don't think of my content as the sort of thing that is really going to change the mind of people who are deeply invested in voting conservative. For them, not being conservative would mean their families stop loving them. They stop being welcome at Christmas, and their friends at work no longer accept them. The older you get, the more that changing or growing your political ideology can feel very dangerous for people. The best that I can really hope for from any of the people who are conservatives who watch me is that they see me as one of the good ones or one of the thoughtful ones. And maybe if they watch enough of my stuff, at some point when they see someone being mistreated by their friends or family, they think to themselves, no, 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 that's not who I am, and that's not how my friends and family are. I need to put a stop to this because otherwise the chicken would be right, and he can't be right. He's always wrong. That's 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 the best that I hope for from my conservative viewers. There was one attack line early on that kept getting repeated by accounts that all had no pictures or bios and generally always seemed to have about 200 followers. They were alleging that Carney was, how you say, dangerous to vulnerable people. Now, to be clear, there has been no reporting by any reputable news company that suggests this. As far as I'm aware, there has been nobody who has come forward to make any sort of accusations. Though there was a photo that was clearly either AI generated or done in Photoshop that claimed to show him with certain people that you would associate with being at risk of harming people, specifically people who we actually have tape recordings of them talking about how close they were with a certain Southern president. So why am I talking about this now if the bots have realized that the attack isn't sticking? I want to talk to you about why this accusation gets hurled around so much, how it's used, and how, by hurling it at all their opponents, right-wingers create cover for people who actually pose a risk. Also, before I continue, if you wouldn't mind sharing or reposting this video and or following me, if you're not already, I'd really appreciate that. I spent a lot of time on this script and editing this video, and I'd like to see it do well. Also, I have researched this topic a lot more than most people that you've ever met, and I'm about to tell you why. In my third year of college, a friend of mine from high school who was actually part of a church that I'd interned at, she told me that she was going public with some information about her stepfather. She didn't go into a ton of details, but he had crossed a line when she was quite young that he should have never crossed. This was difficult for me to hear. Obviously, it was much more difficult for her to talk about, but it was still difficult for me. This was probably back in 2005. There's a lot of stuff that's more common knowledge now than it was back then. Back then, I'd sometimes heard people talk about that it's more about power than anything else, but I didn't really understand what that meant. Now, my friend was not a liar. I knew that. She was a good church kid, and she was probably nearly as compulsively honest as I was. Even her stepdad didn't try and tell people that she was lying. He did tell people, however, that she was confused, and I believe he blamed his ex-wife for tricking her and confusing her. He also may have blamed demons and Satan. I didn't know what to believe. I didn't want to believe that a man who I respected and looked up to could possibly have done that. He generally seemed like a really nice guy. I'd even helped them paint their basement when it was being renovated. His wife was a really good cook, and she was always very nice to me. So accepting that he had done something like that was not an easy thing to accept. When I got back to school after Christmas break, I didn't do I didn't do as much coursework as I should. Instead, I found the abnormal psych section in the college library, and I read, and I read, and I kept those books flat in my lap because I was so scared. I was so scared that anyone would ask me why on earth I would be reading that sort of book. But I didn't understand what was going on, and I really needed to. Also, definitely seemed safer than trying to Google it on the college network. And honestly, back then, I also knew that I was gay, but I grew up in an evangelical environment, and back then, gay was often said in the exact same sentences as a person who does does all the awful things. And it wasn't like I'd been trying to be a gay person. It was just this part of me that at that point I really wanted to not be a part of me. So I honestly had anxiety that maybe there was like something that would just flip one day and I would have these other horrible desires that I didn't want. Later I realized that the gay desires, they're not horrible at all. The other ones, those I still don't have those, and they are still awful. The more I read, the more the same things kept showing up over and over. And to be clear, these were not newfangled woke books. Most of those had covers that I think they're called like cloth covers. Like they weren't paper covers, they weren't leather. Nobody really makes those kinds of books anymore, but there was fabric on the front of them. Often a lot of these didn't even use words like gay or homosexual when talking about gay people. Many used the term invert. That's how old a lot of these books were. But even back then, some of the earliest psychologists all noticed the same things about people who do horrible things. The motivating factor was control. Control, 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 control. There is no other widely held conclusions that anyone who has researched these types of people has come to. I also learned that the extreme need for control is really at the root of all of the worst behavior that humanity does. If Pierre really wanted just a few word slogan to talk about how someone could fix Canada, it would actually say, let go of the need to be in control. Though that would also be very out of character for him. If you think of all the worst people in your life, not just people who aren't safe for kids, but everyone, bad teachers, bad bosses, bad parents, they all have one trait in common. They didn't just set boundaries. They didn't try and like just help you be the best version of you that you could be. They all wanted, nay, insist on control. And to be clear, I know various ideologies will suggest that certain demographics are safer, but that the amount that that bears out is not as solid as a lot of people would like you to think. Now, obviously, there are certain behavior that is way over the line, and that's more commonly done by white men. But I think that also has to do with availability of resources. The more wealth that you can acquire, the easier it becomes to live out a terrible fantasy. And there are other factors in play in terms of the culture that someone is raised in. Racism and sexism, for example, will result in someone with an extreme desire to control, also finding victims that they perceive of as lower status to be more appealing sometimes. Like, it gets really complicated, but it's important to remember this isn't a thing where only men or only white people are dangerous. I was actually at one point in a ministry training program with someone who had a history of working in group homes, and I was talking with him about this topic over lunch. And when I said, because as far as I knew at the time, that it was much more common among men, he looked at me as if I must have misspoken. I was confused, so I asked him, and he asked if that's really what people who researched the topic said. Because anecdotally, working in group homes in Alberta, the people in his line of work who kept getting caught were actually women getting caught with young men. So I don't I don't research this sort of thing professionally, but just understand that you cannot assume just by looking at anyone that they pose no risk, particularly to vulnerable people. Everyone who works with vulnerable populations should always be open to observation at any time, and if they're not, watch them like a hawk. Learning this sort of stuff really changed my outlook on life. Whereas before I was already a pretty empathic and generous person, I lost all appetite for trying to get what I wanted out of someone else if it wasn't freely offered. Particularly in my personal life, out if it wasn't free and didn't want to pay their cable bill on time, well, then I'd tell them that they needed to pay their cable bill before I could turn their TV back on. But in terms of things like dating, if I asked someone out and they said no, I was never going to ask again. If a friend didn't want to do something, I was going to avoid pressuring them into anything. Now, would everyone in my life say that I never try and get what I want or anything like that? I don't think so. I also don't think that that many people are paying attention. But I do personally try and be mindful and avoid being as or and avoid as much as possible being controlling. Many years later, I'd start to learn about narcissism and other cluster B psych disorders. And the more you learn about narcissism, the more you learn that it's a pit stop on the way to worst people on the earth territory. And realistically, yeah, I don't think that there are many people who end up getting caught and found guilty of doing the worst things who won't also score really highly on narcissism if assessed. It comes from the same place. Now, that's not to say that all narcissists do the thing. They don't. But at the same time, while narcissists often talk about it a lot, and they're quick to label their opponents as it with no basis, elected officials are also very inclined to try and protect people who have been accused of doing the thing. They'll readily lambaste their opponents for an inappropriate joke or gesture, but when someone is running for their team and has been banned from a local shopping mall for leering at teenagers, nothing has been proven beyond a shadow of their specific doubts. And so how dare you? It's also worth talking about a thing that has happened in the English language, specifically on social media. There is a word that can mean dog hairdresser. It also means somebody who is slowly conditioning someone to accept behavior that they would not readily accept. It's a process of constantly, slowly pressing at someone's boundaries, but always doing it slowly enough that the person that it's happening to feels like they'll be seen as overreacting if they try and put a stop to things. It can lead to the person feeling embarrassed because they're told that if they didn't like it, they should have said something seconds ago, minutes ago, hours ago, days ago, weeks ago, months ago, years ago. The goalpost always moves. You can't use that word on most social platforms anymore. Why? Why can't we use one of the most effective ways to talk about a strategy that, if people understand and can teach their kids to understand, keeps people safe? Because right-wing people redefined it and then acted badly. A coordinated group of social media influencers and bots started accusing trans people and drag queens of being dog hairdressers, which doesn't make sense. Trans people often have trouble passing, so they would fit in less, not more. And these types of people want to fit in. They do not want you to notice them. Same thing for drag queens. Drag queens stand out, and they also typically do not have any access to kids. There were some like drag queen story hours and stuff like that, but those were the sort of events that parents would take their kids to, and parents would be with the kid the whole time. It would happen in well-lit rooms with very many observers. Nothing was ever happening that was inappropriate. And then the drag queen would pack up her stuff and head out the back door before she took her wig off. But right-wing influencers working with astroturfers who paid a lot of money for bots spread in a matter of weeks enough nonsense that they redefined this term across the English-speaking internet to the point where platforms look for it and will automatically flag and remove posts that use this word that effectively describes the process of understanding how someone plans to abuse someone. One of the most useful words that we had for educating people, nobody's even allowed to properly describe the biggest red flag for people to watch out for. And on paper, the rich people who own the social networks can claim that they're trying to protect trans people from harassment. Lovely. And when people point out to these people that statistically there's no evidence that trans people or drag queens were harming anyone at anywhere near the levels of clergy and coaches, it doesn't matter. We got some word salad about how no, they're not doing that. They're trying to do this new meaning of the word that is bad, but it's really just like, I don't know, teaching kids that people are people and that kids can behave the way that they want to and their parents will still love them, which is silly. My parents took me to the circus when I was a kid. They never worried for a second that I'd want to run away with the circus. But what these incredibly rich controlling people, backed by incredibly rich controlling people, wanted to do was twofold. They wanted to misdirect and make people think that a big shiny drag queen was a danger, so you would be too distracted by that to be worried about laws that politicians might want to enact that put your kids at risk. But beyond that, they ensured that if a wealthy person offers to mentor your kid, if a priest takes special interest, if a sports coach says that they need one on one time, you never for a second wonder if things are going to be okay. So, am I saying that any political figures are the worst kind of people? No. But I will say that power protects power, capital protects capital, and oftentimes power and capital both work relentlessly to protect the worst people. And that's not a coincidence.